So yeah, thank you everybody for being here. This is fun. I didn't expect a party, but looks like we got one anyway. So we appreciate you being here. Hopefully we can all learn a few things about the ketone production curve while fasting and exercising. So that's the title of our project, the effects of exercise on the fasting ketone production curve. So we'll kind of break that down a little bit to see what it means, what we measured, and what we found. Just to start, we want to know what ketones are, right? We talk about a ketone production curve. Ketones are little molecules that float in your body all the time, and they are a product of fat breakdown, and they can be used for all sorts of great things. As you look at this chart on the right, I don't know if you can see my mouse when I move it, but if you see, there's actually 3 ketones that are produced as a product of fat breakdown: acetoacetate, acetone, and then this D-beta hydroxybutyrate. And that beta hydroxybutyrate, we abbreviate BHB. That's the major ketone that floats around in the body, and that's the one we measure. And we measured in this study anyway. We measured this in the blood, as that's the gold standard. So we actually measured that through finger pricks, so you can measure that capillary blood or through venipuncture. So good to know that. And then one thing to kind of keep in mind as we talk about ketones, as we go through this, kind of the general consensus of ketones, as we measure them, you'll see that we measure them in millimoles per liter. And once we hit a level of 0.5, that's when we consider someone to be in nutritional ketosis. That's essentially saying we've converted the body from using carbohydrates, and it's kind of made a transition into using amino acids and these ketones for fuel. But why do we care about ketones? What are some of the utilities of ketones, and why do we want to measure them? Really, the idea behind ketones is that they have been shown in the literature to have a lot of benefits. And so we'll kind of chat about a few of those. One is that they have been shown to help increase insulin sensitivity. So think type 2 diabetes can help with the effects of that, and metabolic syndrome. It's been used, so ketones, and specifically the ketogenic diet, has actually been used for years to help with epilepsy, especially in kids. In fact, when we moved into our place here in Provo, our next door neighbor's kid has epilepsy. And I asked if they'd been using a ketogenic diet to help control those symptoms, and they said, no, absolutely not. Our physician doesn't think it would be good for him. And they got him on some keto-like tube feedings, and he hasn't had a seizure in 2.5 years. So it's pretty cool. They've also been shown to reduce oxidative stress, cellular damage. They've reduced the incidence of hypertension and heart failure. Somebody's scanning something. And also, for me, especially in our family, Alzheimer's disease runs in our family. And having elevated ketones has helped reduce the incidence of neurological diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. So really cool benefits that can come through having elevated ketones. But why fasting? So we kind of alluded to the fact that your body's first fuel source, the one that it goes to first, is carbohydrates, right? And so if you use up the carbohydrates in your body, then it has to turn to adipose. Exercise actually has somewhat of a similar effect, right? Especially high intense exercise burns a lot of glucose and glycogen that's converted. So glycogen is stored a lot in the muscle and in the liver. And so as you use those as your fuel in high intensity exercise, there's not much left, so it has to turn to adipose again. So a lot of research has been done in fasting and exercise, but our question was, what if we combine the two, and what are the effects of those? Mind blown. So we're gonna find out what the results of that were. Any questions so far? Everybody good? Okay.
Keep it up.
So how did we go about this? Here's our demographics. We had 11 males and 9 females. for a total of 20 subjects. And each subject completed both arms of our study. So we had a crossover design study, and both protocols were followed by all the subjects. One protocol involved them coming in and having a 36-hour fast with water only for 36 hours. The other arm of the study was to have them fast for 36 hours again, but this time they started their fast with an intense treadmill exercise. So we were able to compare the differences with and without exercise within their own subjects. So we had a bunch of exclusion criteria. The only ones that played into effect as we screened our subjects were medications. So we didn't want anything that altered metabolism or appetite. Our population was a normal to overweight population, and we had a few obese people apply that we had to turn away. And then otherwise, we had 1 or 2 people that fasted a lot, that fasted regularly. And so we had to make sure that those daily habits weren't going to influence our fasting protocol. So otherwise, everybody that came in was healthy. And this is how we kind of went about our project. So initially we screened everybody. That was just an online screening. We wanted to essentially make sure that they met didn't meet our exclusion criteria, that they were able to participate in pretty physically intense exercise, that they could adhere to the standardized meal that we were giving them, so dietary restrictions and things like that, and that they could meet the time frames and the things we wanted. So if they were approved through all of that, they ran through our screening, we invited them to participate. And when they came in for their initial visit, we took a bunch of measurements, anthropometric measurements. We oriented them to the purpose of the study, how to use our surveys, how to use our equipment, and kind of made sure they were still up for it, and then took a consent as well. They were fed a standardized meal, and that standardized meal was the exact same for both protocols. No matter which protocol they were doing, they got the exact same standardized meal both times. And so that really helped us make sure everybody started on the same playing field at the beginning of their fasts. They had a blood draw, and then if it was their turn to exercise, we gave them some time to digest, and then we ran them on a treadmill. If it wasn't, we performed a DEXA scan, and we did that before their standardized meal and blood draw. Then they'd return to our lab every 12 hours. And while they were there, we took their weight, we did a blood draw, and then we just made sure they were still comfortable with the surveys and with the finger pricks, made sure they had the supplies they needed. Because every 2 hours while they weren't in our lab, we had them taking a survey for their mood and hunger, but also taking a capillary ketone reading with a little finger prick and a little portable device. And we actually had really good success with this. We expected to collect 440 data points between all of our subjects. And we had set up an automated text messaging system. And so we reminded them every 2 hours, send them a text, and it worked really well. We only had 3 missing data points out of the 440 we expected to get. So that worked really well for us. Then they had a washout period of about a week. And then they came back in, and we started it all over again with the second protocol, depending on what they needed to have done. So now the part that really matters. What did we find? We fasted them, we starved them, we exercised them, and the first analysis that we did was an area under the curve analysis. And the reason we wanted to do area under the curve analysis is that it gives us a really good idea of total beta-hydroxybutyrate, total ketone production over the course of the fast. So here's our chart of the ketones. These are from the little finger pricks that they took every 2 hours and recorded for us. And you'll see there's a couple of gaps that are kind of larger. We didn't require them to wake up every 2 hours in the middle of the night to take these. So these were during waking hours. But you'll see that top line is the fasting and exercise. And then that bottom line is fasting only. So there was a smaller area under the curve if they've only fasted, and more area under the curve if they added exercise to it. There was no interaction effect, which was great. There was also no difference between genders. So all of these data points are with both genders combined. So the fasting area under the curve was about 19. When you add exercise, it becomes 27, which doesn't mean a whole lot until you analyze the difference between them and you realize that the beta hydroxybutyrate, or the ketone production, improved by about 43%, or had 43% more ketone production over the course of that fast. So if your goal is to build ketones and you're going to fast for 36 hours, adding exercise can give you what we found, about 43% more beta hydroxybutyrate, which is really interesting. The other analysis that we did, we wanted to see, so we mentioned nutritional ketosis was 0.5, right? So if we look back at our chart here, we can see 0.5. If we follow the line over and down, we can kind of get a rough idea of where people were landing at this 0.5 level. So we wanted to see that, and unfortunately, there was no significant difference between our two protocols in the time that it took to achieve that level of 0.5. What we can tell you is that those who exercised got there in about 17 and a half hours. If you did not exercise, it took you a little over 20 hours. So you had about a 3.5 hour difference. Again, not enough to make it significant. But then we reanalyzed this time to ketosis with subject 20 taken out. And we didn't want to just take them out just because, but this subject actually had a reverse effect of everybody else. All of our other subjects had higher ketones when they exercised and lower when they didn't. This subjects were reversed. And so we thought, well, if this person was the only one that had this, what would happen? And of course, when we did, we got significant difference. It didn't change our numbers a whole lot, as you can see, but it gave us about a 4 hour difference, and that was enough to push us over the edge. So something definitely with the data we have and all of our subjects included, something that we could definitely take a look at again in the future and power a little bit better, but definitely a relationship there worth exploring, I think. So I told you we took blood draws every 12 hours, and here's some of the data from that. We ran ELISA kits. Thank you, Dr. Bickman, for letting us use your lab. We ran ELISA kits to analyze insulin and glucagon. And these were in plasma. So once we collected the blood, we spun it down, pulled out the plasma, and put it in a -80 freezer. And then we put it into these kits. And for our insulin, it's really interesting. You can see within the first 12 hours, we get a pretty dramatic change in that insulin level. To me, that's really interesting in the sense that if your goal is to reduce insulin, yet you don't feel like fasting for 36 hours, to us, it looks like you can get a majority of those insulin dropping benefits within that first 12 hours of fasting. So something really interesting to take into account. There was significant difference from baseline, as those asterisks denote that I just added, between conditions at 24 and 36 hours. Glucagon, as we suspected, would rise. It's a gluconeogenic hormone, and so as glucose goes down, it needs some ways to bring it back up. So glucagon, I apologize, raised. It didn't have that dramatic spike like we saw in insulin, but there were some differences between the conditions at 12, 24, and 36 hours. And then we have our insulin-glucagon ratio. You'll see that just like insulin, it drops pretty significantly within that first 12 hours. And the reason we want to look at this insulin-glucagon ratio is it tells us when our body is kind of it makes what we call that metabolic switch, right? So it goes from using glucose as its primary fuel source to using adipose. And so once we see that ratio drop, that's a really good indication that we've made that switch. And so within, again, 12 hours, we've kind of made a majority of that switch. And that was significant. Whoops, sorry, it's 12 and 24 hours. So we also had surveys every 2 hours, right? And in those surveys, when they took their finger prick and recorded those for us, we had them record that reading that they got in their ketones, but also their mood, their hunger, stomach discomfort, and thirst. So we'll go through those really briefly. Essentially, hunger and stomach discomfort, as we would expect, people got more hungry and more stomach discomfort as the fast went on. But those hunger and stomach discomfort levels were not different between conditions. And we'll talk about why that might be kind of fun and important here in just a minute. And then thirst, the only spike we saw in thirst was right after exercise on their exercise day. That was the only significant difference we saw in that. Otherwise, we encouraged them to be well hydrated throughout the fast. I imagine the reason they were thirsty after exercising is because they had a mask on and they couldn't drink for an hour and they just ran their guts out on a treadmill. So that made sense. But otherwise, thirst was fairly irrelevant. And then as far as mood goes, there were some moods that increased slightly throughout the fast. And as you can suspect, those were kind of negative moods. Anger, depression, tension, and fatigue all slightly increased. But really, as you can kind of gauge from those charts, not a whole lot changing. And then one mood slightly decreased throughout the fast, and that was vigor. So people got more angry and more tired throughout the fast. But just like our hunger, there was no difference between the conditions. So with that, we kind of, to me, that's kind of meaningful and interesting in the sense that we can add exercise to our fast, get more beta hydroxybutyrate and potentially more of those benefits, but not have a negative effect on our mood and our hunger any more than we would if we were just fasting alone. So it's kind of an interesting outcome in that sense. So just to kind of wrap things up, those were the major findings that we found. We feel like this was a really strong, really well-developed study. We had all these great minds of PhDs on our committee putting things together and making sure we had all of our ducks in a row. So we really feel like this can inform certain fasting protocols, especially the popular 18 or 16-8. You may look at that and say, well, it may not be enough to reach ketosis if you're doing a 16-8 fasting protocol. So maybe alternate day fasting is what I want to do. We can say that exercise significantly increased your beta hydroxybutyrate over a 36-hour fast when you start with an intense exercise. Again, we're not sure about that official time to ketosis. That's a relationship we really want to explore and look into a little further. We really enjoyed that insulin and glucagon reacted positively in that ratio as well. And then again, our mood, hunger, and thirst weren't affected, which to me is a great thing. That means I can exercise and not be more grumpy from it, yet get a lot of benefits. So our future research, we want to look at exercising at various times throughout the fast. That may be one kind of strange thing about our protocol. We had everybody fasting, starting a fast and exercising at night. And often our subjects wouldn't get done exercising till 9:30 or 10 o'clock p.m. So adding these exercises in at various time points of a fast, we'd love to see those effects. And then we also recognized that the exercise we did was really intense. The METs on our exercise ended up being a little bit over 9, which is pretty intense. That was intentional. We wanted to burn a lot of carbohydrates. We wanted to burn a lot of glucose and glycogen. And so we intended it for it to be that way. But we also recognize that there may be a lot of people that cannot participate in that intensive exercise for that period of time. So we want to explore those benefits as well. That pretty much wraps things up. Huge, huge thank you to my committee, Dr. Bailey, the chair, Dr. Tucker, Dr. Davidson, and Dr. Bickman for being the great minds behind this and for having great glamour shots on Google that I could put into my slideshow. Dr. Fellingham also, he helped a lot with the statistical analysis, so we appreciate his efforts. Of course, my beautiful family who has had many late nights without me as I've stayed here collecting data and writing papers. And then our wonderful research team who phlebotomists and research assistants who helped make all that possible and really took a huge load off of my plate. So I appreciate every single one of you. This was not just my efforts that made this happen. This was a really solid project. That was a culmination of a lot of people's efforts, so thank you. And we can entertain any questions that you might have.